Hi there, Alison here with another Cab Franc du jour. Today we're in the Niagara Peninsula of Ontario, Canada, and we're looking at the Trius 2017 Red Shale Cabernet Franc. Trius Winery is part of the Andrew Peller Group, one of Canada's largest wine companies, and they own several premium wineries in both Ontario as well as British Columbia. Their head winemaker, Craig McDonald, is an Australian native, and he made wine in Australia, New Zealand, Oregon, and California, all before eventually settling in Ontario. His first vintage here was in 1997 with Cave Spring Cellars, and he started with Trius in 2010. Now, I've shown a number of Cabernet Francs from the Niagara Peninsula so far, but they've all been from the same general viticultural area known as the Niagara Escarpment. Today's wine is coming from a different area known as Niagara-on-the-Lake, and these two viticultural areas are separated by about 20 kilometers or so, that's 12 miles, with the city of St. Catharines kind of right smack dab in between them. Now, this area of Niagara-on-the-Lake is bordered to the north by Lake Ontario, to the west by the Welland Canal, and to the east by the Niagara River. And it can be divided into four distinct VQA sub-appellations: Four Mile Creek, the Niagara River, Niagara Lakeshore, and the St. David's Bench. Today's wine is coming from the 4 Mile Creek VQA sub-appellation, and this area can be characterized as this rather large, flat kind of swath of land, more or less in the middle of this Niagara-on-the-Lake area. And in terms of the climate here, the main feature is because we have this flat topography, these vineyards will receive full sun exposure during the growing season. As a result of this full sun exposure, there's a good heat accumulation in the vineyards. And because we have this big body of water, Lake Ontario, not too far away, there becomes this heat exchange. They call it a convection current, where the heat rises in the evenings, and then it essentially helps to pull in all of this cool air into the vineyard sites in the evening hours, helping to drop the overall vineyard temperature at nighttime. So we get this nice diurnal range in temperature in these vineyards in 4 Mile Creek. As a result of this diurnal shift, this helps to prolong the growing season, aid ripening, also helps with flavor intensity and color intensity in the varieties. And because of these conditions, over time, this area of 4 Mile Creek has become very well known for its Bordeaux-inspired red wines. Now, the bedrock here is known as Queenston Formation Red Shale, and this bedrock was formed during the Upper Ordovician period, which is part of the Paleozoic era, which means that it was formed between 445 and 485 million years ago. That's 250 million years before the dinosaurs even roamed the earth, which makes this shale really ancient. But what is shale? Shale is a mudstone. It's a sedimentary soil, and specifically this Queenston Formation Red Shale is a combination of red and gray calcareous and argillaceous shales, and they have a high iron oxide content in them. Now, the topsoils here, they do vary depending on where you are in 4 Mile Creek, but what we're essentially dealing with here are glacially derived soils that were deposited here after the last ice age. Now, for today's wine, it's all estate fruit from a single vineyard site, the Clark Farm Vineyard, which is more or less kind of right in the middle of this 4 Mile Creek VQA sub-appellation. We've got 8 acres of Cabernet Franc planted here. It was planted in 2006. It's all clone 214, which is the Loire clone. And we are on that Queenston Formation Red Shale bedrock. And we've got about 1.5 meters of what is known as Halton till. This is a clay loam soil, and it is mostly clay, about 70% clay, and then the remainder is sort of an equal split between silt and sand. And Craig noted to me that this vineyard is a little bit more on the stonier side, which is not really common in 4 Mile Creek. But as you walk the site, there's actually sort of visible shards and sort of these red shale stones throughout the vineyard. Now, from a winemaking perspective, the fruit was harvested sort of in two passes, if you will. The first two on the earlier side, the first to preserve more sort of red fruit character, a bit more acidity, and then the second would have been for more concentration, a bit more alcohol, and some more darker fruit characters. And then from a winemaking perspective, we're dealing with destemmed fruit, not crushed. Fermentation was a combination of indigenous as well as cultured yeast in these 4-ton wooden fermenters. And they did do some different cap management techniques during the active fermentation. And then the post-fermentation maceration lasted about 14 days at 20 degrees Celsius. Now, from an aging perspective, this wine spent some time in French oak, mostly older oak. About 20% or so of that is new, and was in oak for about 20 months before bottling. Now, I should mention as well, in Ontario, we do receive a vintage variation here, and 2017 would be classified as a cooler vintage. July and August were on the cooler side, very rainy, but the vintage was saved by September and October that were much sunnier and very dry, which was perfect for sort of later season varieties like Cabernet Franc. So let's get into the wine. Now, immediately the nose has this really deep, kind of sultry, kind of brambly profile. Definitely leans dark fruited. I'm getting some notes like black currant. There's a little plum here. But there is a little kiss of like sort of a red fruit note as well, like a sort of a sweet red cherry note. But it does lean more fruit forward as opposed to sort of more savory or herbaceous. But the pyrazines are there. They just take a little bit of a back seat, but they kind of balance the fruit nicely. There's this sort of nice cured tobacco note. There's also a little bit of sort of like fall herbs, like sort of sage or savory. And there's also a lovely sort of top note of kind of licorice or anise and a little bit of like a dried, delicate kind of dried violet note as well. The acidity on this is quite pronounced, very mouth-watering, very vibrant. And the tannins are super fine, definitely on the firmer side for sure. They have a nice velvety texture and a certain degree of chew to them as well. You can really get the sense that this wine was built for some longer term cellaring in mind. All those same fruits come through really nicely on the palate. And then there's these additional layers of, there's a little bit of cocoa, there's some coffee here. It's quite spicy on the palate as well. There is some definite sort of clove or baking spice notes, like which is probably some of that oak influence coming through, but there's also a really nice kind of punchy black peppercorn thing going on as well, which is quite nice. There is a lot of concentration to the palate here, a lot of intensity. It's a full-bodied wine for sure, but it's not heavy. There's so much acidity here that it really does help to kind of cleanse your palate, and it really invites you, it kind of inspires you to really want to go back to the glass and take another sip. There is a certain heartiness as well to this wine. It's classically styled, if you will. It's the sort of wine that I would want to blind for somebody that is really into right bank Bordeaux, because it shows some of those classic characters that I would think in a blind tasting, people would immediately think of something from Saint-Emilion because of how this wine sort of shows itself. Yeah, there's a certain degree of richness, of heartiness, as I said, but it's also restrained as well. There's some definite markers of a cooler climate in this wine for sure. It's the sort of wine that for me is deeply satisfying. It really kind of hits me at this carnal level in terms of how satisfying it is. And it's probably because it sort of recalls these memories. I cut my teeth on wines like this when I started in the business in terms of the winery that I worked at. So it's these sorts of Cabernet Francs from Ontario that are very familiar to me. And I think that reason is why this wine feels so satisfying. But it also has this sort of gastronomic quality. You know, we're coming into fall, the weather is cooling down, at least here in the Northern Hemisphere. But when I was making notes on this wine, I literally was like, beef cheeks, I need beef cheeks. Because this sort of wine makes you want to braise something low and slow, curl it by the fire, wrap myself in a blanket, and just chill with this wine and enjoy it. It's really delicious. If you've had this wine before, let me know what you thought of it in the comments below, or if you have another favorite Cabernet Franc from the Niagara-on-the-Lake area, let me know what that is in the comments below. And of course, as always, I will be back again soon with another wine. Cheers.